In Confessions of an Opium Eater, Thomas de Quincey referred to it as a portable ecstasy. 19th century physicians called it God's own medicine. Whatever the motivation, the growth in opium consumption signaled the beginning of a new American drug era. Between 1840 and 1870, imports of the poppy product grew at 7 times the rate of the population.
Started out, you know, with Osley and Timothy Leary, and they were experimenting. They would do experiments, you know, right in the colleges. You could take some acid, sit there with doctors and stuff, see how you made out. You know, that was an experiment with what we thought was a mind-broadening chemical, and which I believe was. You know, I think it changed my life, and probably bunches of other people. I have friends also that went too far and are casualties. They're not dead. They're walking around like really strange. You know, it's sad. So I want to be sounding like I'm promoting drug usage. I'm just talking about a different time. You know, we didn't have people telling us how it would kill you. You know, we had Reefer Madness, which was the anti-marijuana movie about people smoking marijuana and jumping out of windows. We all knew it was a bunch of jive. It was a lie. So if they were going to lie to us, why believe anything else they said?
Early 1960s America was a nation at war within. The civil rights struggles, the free speech movement, rise of feminism, disillusionment with Vietnam, all contributed to a rebellious climate. The counterculture drug movement was a rejection of the establishment that deepened into a mystic exploration of new consciousness. Adventurers smoked, popped and dropped an amazing array of renegade chemicals, both organic and synthetic.
Tons of fun. It was experimentation. And it was also revolutionary because at that time, right at the beginning there, it was an anti-drinking thing too. To stereotype them, you know, drinkers would go out, get loaded, and beat each other up. You know, we'd smoke a bunch of pot and think of beautiful things, very corny. You know, maybe make some love, think about ending a war.
By the late 1960s, marijuana was the badge of certification for the pacifist movement. Peace symbols and pot smoke mingled at anti-war protests. The 1969 Woodstock concert was the hippie generation's boldest example of peace through drugs. Nearly 500,000 people converged on a 35-acre lot. Despite rain, lack of food and shelter, and clouds of marijuana smoke, there was no violence. For Americans abroad, marijuana was also the main drug of choice, but for different reasons. It was less a symbol than a means to cope.
I think it was a form of protest. I think it was a form of release. I think it was just utter frustration in being part of a war that, you know, it took us about 2 or 3 weeks to figure out that, you know, this wasn't the war we were led to believe it was. And the war we were led to believe it was, we were there to help a people attain their freedom from communism, this, that, and the other. And my experience was that the people I came in encounter with, they could care less. All they wanted to do was be left alone and left to live their own lives.
Drug use by American soldiers proved much more controversial than civilians at home.
To the extent money can help in meeting the problem of dangerous drugs, it will be available. This is one area where we cannot have budget cuts, because we must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number 1 in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
When President Nixon declared his war on drugs in 1971, he had Vietnam veterans in mind. Exaggerated media reports from Vietnam estimated 25% of soldiers had used heroin, and the overriding concern was that they were bringing the unsavory habit home. Throughout the 1970s, the federal government issued a series of inconsistent drug policies. As the new law and enforcement arm, the DEA geared up. Government action against drugs, other than heroin, continued to mellow.
You had a police system that decided in the early 1970s that it no longer was going to arrest casual users, so that the risks associated with the use of cocaine and marijuana in large parts of the country virtually disappeared.
It started as a counterculture movement, but it expanded to the point where people were arguing that drug use was being normalized within our population. And in fact, more than 50% of our high school population in those years and through the mid-'80s had experimented with drugs by the time they graduated from high school.
Is that a joint, man? That goddamn looks like a quarter pounder, man.
Media of the time mirrored increasing acceptance and consumption of marijuana and cocaine. Use of both soared through the 70s, and when marijuana reached its peak, the champagne drug of the upper crust continued to spiral on.
I mean, I can remember back in the 80s in Rochester, going to parties where cocaine was being used by upper middle class people, saying, "Oh wow, Judy, you got to try this. This is the most wonderful thing since sliced bread. Has no effect, great for your sex life, blah blah blah."
And once again, we had so wiped out the memory of that first cocaine epidemic. It was as if it all happening over again. Public memory of cocaine had faded away because most of the people who were really familiar with what cocaine did early in the century were dead.
To Washington nearly 5.5 years ago, we pledged to put America's house in order. Well, that required more than economic reform and bolstering our national defense. Our country was threatened by an epidemic of drug abuse. It's been growing in intensity since the 1960s. By 1980, illegal drugs were every bit as much...
By the time President Reagan declared his drug war in 1986, cocaine use was reaching alarming proportions. It was no longer just the drug of the rich. It was also available to the poor thanks to an ingenious marketing move by illegal drug suppliers.
Cocaine was not a big substance in the black or Hispanic community. It was called the rich man's high, okay? But they couldn't afford it. Then someone came along and made crack, a derivative of it, and made it highly affordable. Now it's widespread, killing
cocaine.
people.
And this goes for about $5 outside on the street. And this...
In 1986, illegal drug use shot up to become the #1 polled concern of the nation. For most Americans, the human toll had risen too high. The cocaine overdose of the Boston Celtics' #1 draft choice, Len Bias, was an emotional punctuation point in history.
Now, what's wrong with you? Tonsillitis?
Appendicitis?
Yeah!
When the Partnership for a Drug-Free America launched its public awareness campaign in 1986, Americans were receptive. A blizzard of television ads surrounded network programming.
Or your local policeman, would you still say marijuana is harmless?
At the beginning of this year, someone asked me if I wanted to make a New Year's wish, and I said yes, and it was that I'd like to see every young person in the world join the Just Say No to Drugs Club.
Americans were more skeptical of Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign. It seemed an unrealistic answer to drug-infested communities, but her emphasis on prevention encouraged many public schools to implement drug education curricula.
We're getting tough on drugs, and we mean business.
By the late 1980s, a decade of congressional reports supported expansion of prevention and treatment. But as federal drug budgets grew, funding for prevention and treatment did not. The majority of polled Americans supported interdiction. The government deepened search and seizure controls and implemented federal employee drug testing.
I'll give you a funny survey piece of data. Between about 1985 and 1992, we increased the amount of federal money being spent on interdiction from roughly about a couple of $2 billion to $15 billion. The perceived availability of cocaine and marijuana during that entire period remained absolutely constant. It did not decline one bit.
There's too much money to be made in drugs and very low educational requirements for selling drugs, that there's a large enough population out there willing to take the risk of selling drugs. So that generally has not worked at all.